Hey, let's get started. Good afternoon and welcome back. This is our third to last meeting, and our last class meeting where we're going over new content since we've got Monday for the presentations and then Wednesday for ORA. Our office is just finalizing location, and then once we have that, I'll let you know where we're scheduled to meet for next Wednesday's class. I do really appreciate you developing some of those questions last class and encourage you to ask them and anything else that you might be thinking about. Once we have them sharing, we'll probably have the chance for them to share. They'll do a Q&A, and then that will kind of wrap up the major things for the term. So we're getting pretty close to the end here. So last class, we were starting our final week content talking about some of the emerging ideas and issues in communication and social, right? So outside of this class, as we're continuing to explore issues and topics that are impacting people, right? There's a whole lot that's going to continue to play out. And I wanted to have us end the term with a few readings that I think do a good job of setting the stage to where we might be going next, and some additional issues that we can explore. In particular, on Monday, we took some time to talk about this idea of food justice and food tourism, to talk about the role of equity in securing access to safe food and conceptualizing new ways of encouraging people to participate, doing something like a tour or trip in order to raise awareness and education about the work that's happening toward equity. In particular, we were highlighting the ways in which food advocacy and food justice is centering experiences of individuals who are marginalized and hurt. This idea that food is in many ways power, right? Because it's something we fundamentally need to survive, but its distribution and access is often inequitable. The idea that a food desert is not a geological certainty, but rather a product of social and economic relations, is helping us to reconsider and understand what all is happening and ways in which the engagement and participation through a lot of these movements, including community gardens, local spaces in places like Denver, help us to point to the ways that locally situated activism can push us toward social and political change. So today, we're going to be looking at the last two readings. So both the piece related to Indigenous protest as well as the piece related to the rhetoric of motherhood in the Flint water crisis. Also remember that December 4th, this Sunday, is the 7th Canvas prompt. The 8th and final Canvas prompt will be posted next week and will be related to the ORA meeting and the remainder of the presentations. We also have two presentations that were sent to me through video due to travel for competition for the last couple weeks. So we'll see these videos and I'll see if there's any feedback that we'd like to send along to them about some of the things that you've noticed there. So next Monday is the Creative Movement presentations. Again, we'll have plenty of time to go through all of them, and I'm hoping it'll be kind of a fun environment for us to meet and hear about some of the work that you're doing. Again, I'm really impressed and excited about the things that you've been talking about and starting to work on. And then on the 14th will be just the write-up that I'm asking you to complete that reflects on the work that you did for the presentation. And we do not have any sort of meeting for the final exam period. So that kind of gives us a glance at the remaining things to do. Again, this is the schedule for next Monday. So we'll just go down the line and have people present and share their presentations. Again, you have 5 minutes, give or take, for kind of a grace period of a minute if you need it. Please email or post to Canvas any visual aids that you need that might include things such as slides or anything else that you might need in preparation for Monday. And I'm happy to supply you with that. I'll also, give you some time signals to let you know how you're doing as we're working through all of that. And again, I'm looking forward to seeing you all share what you're doing. I would ask that for attendance that you stick around for the whole class meeting. so that we can hear what we're all doing and have the chance so that we all have an audience to share the work that's being put. So we'll hear from Madison and Britt's video presentations, and then after that, we'll be looking at Indigenous activism in the mediated environment, that piece, and then the piece about rhetoric and motherhood. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the videos of our presenters. Encourage us to hear a little bit about what they're doing, and as you're watching, see if you have any questions, thoughts, or reactions that you're interested in sharing about these.
Hello, everyone. My name is Madison Morgan, and for my social movement, I will be doing it on a moment of absence at a men's basketball game here at EOU. I wanted to do this movement because I wrote about Title IX in my social movement analysis essay. The definition of Title IX is no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program or activity for receiving federal financial assistance. Having the opportunity to play sports is important for everybody. It keeps people active as well as giving outlets to meet other people. Title IX also gives women the opportunity to get an education and to do more for themselves than just staying at home. It took a long time for women to be able to play in college sports, and now they are dominating the field or the court by bringing home national championships. With that being said, the world is not able to see all of these women playing because it is not streamed on the big broadcasts such as ESPN. Universities are speaking out on different articles to make it known that these women's sports should be broadcast on TV. Throughout my analysis, I talked about the different ways universities would communicate, and one of them was on social media or through different articles online or newspapers. Broadcasting women's sports has gotten better, but I think more games need to be broadcasted on ESPN. The use of social media is huge when it comes to social movements, especially nowadays. Social media is going to be a big part of this social movement because we are at a college and so many students have media, and that is how they find out things that are going on around the campus. Having the students see the different posts about a moment of absence happening will allow them to understand what is going on. From the book Rhetoric of Social Movements, it talks about how visuals have considerable persuasive power and how effective it is to show people the movement and tell them about it. The book also talks about narratives and how it is used to tell stories that provide the issues in different situations to understand the problem. Showing students on social media about this social movement will help them want to come, hopefully, and it will also just, like, instead of telling them about it, showing them will make them want to come. The social movement that I am creating is a moment of absence at a men's basketball game here. The reason why I'm doing this is to show what it is like to not be watched by other people. Women do not get broadcasted on TV very often, so doing a moment of absence at a men's game will make a statement. To get this movement started, there will be posts on social media regarding what time the game is and what it will look like. I think having the people who are participating in this movement will go to the warm-ups and sit in the student section, but when it is time to announce the starting lineup, the people will walk out. This will just show, like, everyone that is there, the teams playing, the coaches, that it is a serious situation and that, you know, women deserve to be seen, and they will just show what it is like to be a woman when they're not getting seen. Having a walkout before the game starts will make a statement on how it feels to be a woman playing sports. Men have the option to be broadcast on ESPN. Women's sports get that option very rarely. And to end this presentation, the social movement shows how social media will help the movement get started. Media today is huge and helps get the word out there. A moment of absence at a college basketball game will make a statement for people to understand how important it is to support women as well. Women do not get broadcast on TV as much as men, and this movement is an example of what it is like in an in-person environment. Here are my references.
All right, so I enjoyed getting the chance to hear some of Madison's work there. I think, you know, in talking with Madison about developing this idea, I think it's really interesting to see this combination of using social media, particularly as an organizing tool, with creating absence at this event, right? Trying to make the word that we are going to choose not to attend as a way of showing the challenges of participation and involvement in these sports. So I think, again, is speaking to a lot of the interplay that we've been talking about between online settings for mobilization, face-to-face participation, and the impact that some of that engagement can have too. I'll let Fritz here next.
The social movement that I created is the men's mental health movement. This movement is all about bringing awareness and breaking stigma around mental health, and especially for men. So I included a few statistics here just to help put in perspective how serious men's mental health is. And so there are 3.9 deaths by suicide for each female death by suicide, and one male death by suicide every 14.4 minutes in the US. I just provided these just to kind of give some background information and just more information so people can feel like they have more of an idea of why I chose this movement. So the first thing that I would do in my social movement would have a mental health event. And this would just be about bringing people together to educate them on men's mental health. And I would try to include games and different activities to make learning about men's mental health more fun and lighthearted, and just so people can feel like they're being educated and really take in the information that I'm trying to give them. At the end of the event, I'll also provide an opportunity for guests to ask me questions about men's mental health, and I would also give them the opportunity to share their own experiences, and that way they can connect with people who have gone through the same things and can kind of relate to the things that they've gone through, just so they can feel like they have a support system. So the main overall communication strategy would be social media, because I believe it can reach a wide variety of people at any place in time. So the first use of social media I would do would be a Instagram page. It would be all about bringing awareness and sharing facts about men's mental health. And I kind of made a mock Instagram here, and it just would provide like small tips about men's mental health and how just regulating men's mental health and how just bringing more awareness. That way they can feel like men can feel like they're being advocated for. The next form of communication that I would use would be a website, and this would also include strategic narrative. The website would provide resources, the suicide lifeline number, and a page of personal stories. And as you can see, I made like a mock website right here, and it would just have a bunch of resources and like a page about like why I started this movement and kind of like the work that I've done. And then it will also have a page where people can put their own experiences and own stories, and that way people can relate to them and they can feel like they have a support system, and they can kind of create an online community for them. So I believe it was important to include how I would respond to criticism, because many social movements get criticized. And so I feel like people who discredit mental health and believe that it is not as serious as it is would be the only ones to push back against my movement. And in response to their criticism, I would just do my best to keep them educated and provide them with more statistics and facts, just so they can feel like they have more information and get more educated on this subject, so they'll be more likely to take in the information that I'm trying to share. I would also want to make sure that people who do support my movement feel like they have a space to feel safe and like they are heard and important. I don't want them to feel like the criticism is directed towards them, because that can make them feel attacked. So I would just try to provide a safe space for them, just so they don't feel outed or feel like their feelings aren't validated. And here are my references. Thank you.
Yeah, so I enjoyed seeing what Britt put together as well, right? And focusing on men's mental health, and particularly kind of recognizing and kind of preempting some of the criticism and pushback that that type of movement might have. I thought that the inclusion of the visuals like Instagram and example website also helped us kind of visualize that, and recognizing the role of stigma and the cultural perceptions in that process, I think is a good thing to point to as well, right? A lot of the narratives and storytelling we hear that tries to personalize or put blame on people for mental health and mental health related stigma is something that I think that a lot of movements like these are able to address. So cool to see both of these and get a better sense of what they've been working on. If you have any specific feedback, questions, thoughts, or things that you'd like me to send to either of them, just email that to me and I'll get that out. But I thought that was a good way to get us started in seeing these presentations, seeing the work that they are putting in. Again, unfortunate that they can't join us face to face, but good that we still got to see the work that they're putting together. So I want to shift gears here and have us begin to look at these last two readings and some of the major ideas that these readings bring to the table here, and again, helping us to think broadly about social change communication, where it's headed, what it can do. And again, there's a lot of really specific examples in this chapter. I find that there's also a lot of more jargon and technical language, a little bit of complex material to work through. So I think unpacking a little bit in this reading will be really useful for us as we're trying to understand this legacy and history of a lot of forms of Indigenous activism and protest. So understanding Indigenous activism, including responses to land grabs, requires knowledge, according to this reading, of the complexities of colonization, specifically in the ways in which colonization is controlling knowledge production and the ways that we understand how exploitation occurs, right? So we're talking about Indigenous communication and Indigenous movements in the past with the Lake reading about Red Power. And one of the key ideas here is that sometimes a movement is not for you, right? You're not the audience. Sometimes the movement is internal and about members of the group developing a sense of shared identity. But in this case, you see a contrast where there's a very specific focus on understanding and unpacking the role of power and marginalization. So I think that this one really is helping to both expose the strategies of resistance, but also is trying to unpack the logics that create these forms of exploitation in the first place. And pictured here is the Soul movement, which was one of the major Indigenous movements that was analyzed here. So there's a few core ideas that I really want to get at here that I think this chapter brings that help us to understand this topic in more detail. So there are a whole lot of movements that are studied here in terms of Indigenous groups, a variety of locations in New Zealand and the United States. But one of the key threads here is that by understanding these movements in terms of advocacy for land, water, and river rights, we're focusing on how claims to recognition, understanding, and situating somebody's experiences anchor the material struggles against dispossession. In other words, the material, tangible, impactful impact of losing land, losing resources, and elements needed for survival, and no longer having possession of those resources, right, are specific ways that Indigenous populations are speaking out. Using community ties and solidarity to better understand participation. Again, through creating these channels of communication, of engagement, we can understand and unpack this legacy and history of violence. What's at the heart of Indigenous resistance to the global forces of capitalist colonial extraction, right? So this reading is drawing kind of overlap between how colonialism and capitalism operate together in a way that can be exploitative. Is placing Indigenous knowledge as the epistemic basis of transforming political global economy. So we'll unpack this a little bit more, but epistemic, right? Epistemology reveals knowledge, So epistemology is how we know what we know, how we have acquired and used knowledge in our lives. So what knowledge counts, what knowledge is important to us, and what knowledge are we using to make sense of the world. In many ways, situating Indigenous knowledge is an important way that we can better understand history, legacy, context, and relevance of these different issues, right? We've talked in this class about how controlling of a narrative is a really crucial element of movements, being able to frame and portray an issue. For instance, portraying evicted people as victims, banks as aggressors was one strategy that was used. But in addition to that, what knowledge do we have? How is knowledge controlled and used is an important element at play here. Some ideas about positioning. Indigenous people as underdeveloped, right, or savage is, of course, a racist stereotype and trope that has been used strategically. Again, referring to epistemology, how we know things, right? This form of knowledge about Indigenous perspectives, of course, in many ways, impacts and distorts the heart of Indigenous experience. And pushing back against the whiteness of environmental and justice movements for technocratic solutions, right? So one of the critiques of a lot of movements like this one is that operating within a system or within a frame that creates structural barriers and violence is not an approach that necessarily works or achieves the goals that members of that group have. We again see this contrast in approaches as we've been talking about it in this class. Some people who are very focused on reformist and incremental approaches that work within an existing system or structure, which can be really strategic, but this very much falls in the frame of an outsider strategy that is in many ways critiquing and saying the reformist or insider strategies that are available are not good enough. We need to do this. And this chapter is also looking at the key role of media, including social media and digital spaces, as a way of getting the word out and providing an alternative ecology, right? A way in which people are connecting and engaging with one another. One example I was noticing, tracking some of their social media activity as well, is referring to North America as the Turtle Islands, right? And using that frame to rethink how we're discussing and geographically referring to locations. So a really key idea here that's brought in to try to understand and unpack this experience is subaltern studies theory. And this is a theory that comes from a lot of critical and cultural work. So if you are taking a course related to anthropology, sociology, or psychology, there's a chance that you might run into this idea. This comes from the author Gayatri Spivak, who is approaching this from the frame of Indian women and experiences that women in India oftentimes have as a result of both intersecting identities and the role of class and caste systems in other countries. So Spivak's central question is, can these subalterns speak, right? So subaltern refers to populations who experience marginalization and a ruling class, right, or individuals of power who are shaping an understanding of social and political issues. That is, subaltern populations are populations who find themselves marginalized and experiencing these forms of oppression. But I think that the really important idea here is not only that this marginalization is experienced, but as Spivak argues, no, in many situations, the subaltern cannot speak because individuals who find themselves in marginalized statuses are not always given the material resources and opportunity to articulate and speak out against the oppression that they experience, right? If you're not given a platform or a space in which you can speak and address and push back against an issue, if you are not provided with the educational opportunities, training, and support, that is a way in which power works to try to shut out those experiences, voices, and perspectives. So Spivak argues that we not only need to understand how to support marginalized voices, but to understand what is keeping marginalized voices from being able to speak out against these issues to the extent that we might otherwise think that they can. So as a theory, this helps us to push back against assumptions about history and context. Again, the usage of racist frames of Indigenous people as savage or uncivilized are strategies that are used here to try to engage in epistemic injustice. So pushing back against these assumptions and stereotypes is a crucial way that we can better situate these marginalized experiences. A really related concept that I think is important here is this notion of epistemic injustice. There's a really good book by Dr. Miranda Fricker, who gets into a very foundational understanding of what epistemic injustice is. Again, epistemology refers to, and I always think of a joke in the TV show BoJack Horseman. What do we know? Do we know things? Let's find out, right? How do we know what we know? How do we acquire and gain the knowledge that we do? That's what epistemology is about, okay? So if that's the case, how do we know who we are? How do we know about issues like history, society, and the world, right? We know that that's not neutral. Ask any history professor and they'll tell you there is no objective account of history, because we as human beings are writing history, we're framing, we're situating what stories and perspectives are being included, right? You might recall from several years ago, there was a case in which the public textbooks for history courses in Texas were including content that was in many ways glossing over colonization and violence against indigenous populations, made it seem like, oh yeah, here's the land, here you go, rather than acknowledging and engaging with that. That'd be an example of epistemic injustice, right? Of how our knowledge is created in a skewed way, and how what we are coming to know and think about needs to be reevaluated. One term that I think is a really useful tool in helping to understand this is this idea of unlearning, right? Of thinking about the assumptions or beliefs that we have and trying to take a step back and understand, why do we think the way we do about this, right? I think Britt's presentation was a good example of this, of thinking about how mental health is oftentimes framed in a stigmatizing way. You're responsible for your depression, rather than understanding and unlearning that to examine the other factors that contribute to those experiences. So I'm also a big fan of this quotation that I think situates epistemic injustice too, that knowledge must always be knowledge from a certain location. This gets at the role of ideas like feminist standpoint theory that explore how the understanding we have of issues is shaped by our own lived experience and perspective on those things, right? So, how we might interpret an event in our lives. Does everything happen for a reason, or is the world chaos? That's shaped by the vantage point that we have. What histories are we told? How do we know what we know? Right? That's really at the core of what epistemology is getting at. I wanted to share a clip as well, because there's a lot of examples here of these forms of Indigenous activism. There's a clip from Soul, which was one of the major Indigenous activist groups protesting on behalf of land rights, that I think helps us to contextualize a lot of what's being identified here.
The sacred piece of Māori land taken by the Crown in 1865 and eventually sold to Fletcher Building, which wants to put almost 500 houses on it. Now, activists, of course, as we've seen in the news, they aren't having a bar of it. Among them, Tanya Newton, who has led the fight to save this town. She is with us live. Morena.
Good morning.
Tanya, tell us what's happened overnight.
So overnight, there have been hundreds of kaitiaki who would say arrived to the figure and to stand in solidarity with our whānau and our marae to protect our wāhitaki and this rare cultural heritage landscape.
And this morning?
This morning we can expect that there's going to be more buses arriving from Poneke and Hokianga and Taranaki as well. But this morning I was running a little bit late because police were beginning to advance on the 10th area where there are Kaitaki and families currently staying in defence of the building.
And what are your concerns around that?
My major concern at the moment is a possible arrest. We've seen over the last couple of days there's a likely to happen during dusk and dawn, which takes my mind back to the dawn rain. And I think of our Pasifika whānau and Māori who lives in that. My concern are with the families and the tamariki and our own whānau and our marae and the legacy that might be left for our whakakaira.
You got quite emotional earlier when you saw some of the pictures that we've been running. You haven't seen a lot of that because you've been caught in the middle of it. This is really personal for you, isn't it?
Absolutely, this is my tūranga waiwa. And in Pākehā terms, you would describe that as a place where you feel your greatest sense of belonging and place. This is where I've grown up. This is where I envision my mokopuna and my children's placenta, their funeral will go if I have children in the future.
One of the local iwi, Te Kauro Maki, they are, I guess, trying to discredit you, really. They've made some pretty bold statements. They've said you are not mana whenua, that you are an outsider, that you're basically a troublemaker who's come in here and that you do not represent the people of the land. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I've been described as an awaho, a foreigner. And it's really sad that you would see these elders or kaumātua abusing their privilege. You know, my aroha goes to them, but my kaumātua and our kuia from our papakaina and our marae, they are supporting us and they've guided us through this over the past 4.5 years. They haven't been aiding and abetting our features as they may have been, but my guidance comes from my kaumātua and my kuia who are standing on the front lines with us to defend our whānau and our waihataki.
So your line on this is that there are actually multiple iwi involved here. There are multiple iwi that are claiming a stake in this land. Not all of them have been involved in that consultation process. Is that right?
Absolutely. There are many hapui affiliated to our marae, and none of them have been consulted about whether or not this development should go ahead.
Fletcher is saying, look, this is a done.
So I think this is a really good example here of this idea that, you know, we are not, that colonialism is not in past tense, right? That it is still ongoing and is still impacting populations. You know, we of course notice this in the context of Dakota Access Pipeline. If we're looking at the impacts of environmental racism and the displacement of Indigenous communities in particular by this, we're also looking at cases like this one in which the attempts by government to try to reacquire and take and develop land that is designated for Indigenous populations, right, is an example here of the continued impacts and effects that colonialism as a framework is having on people. I also think in looking at epistemic injustice and epistemic reframing, right, the interviewee's use of specific language, right, and integration of the kind of native language, not just as terms, but also as ideas, as concepts, of talking about the history, significance, and sense of place of a land in a way that doesn't necessarily translate easily one-to-one. That speaks to epistemology, knowledge, and the ways in which, for many cultures and groups, right, there are specific experiences and understandings that are developed, that can be used, and that can be situated in place to reevaluate this conflict and what's occurring. So what I would like you to do is take some time in a partnership or group of 3. And what I would like you to do is to look through, take a glance of some of these movements and some of the strategies that were being used for Indigenous rights. And pick one that especially stands out to you and your partner or group of 3, and be prepared to share some of the things you're noticing. What are some of the common patterns that you're noticing in activism discussed in this chapter? And how might these connect to these ideas of subaltern studies and epistemic injustice? And this is the chapter 15 of Frick. I believe it starts around 280, 285. So you're welcome to pick a partnership or group of 3. Make sure you have at least one person in the group who has access to the chapter who can work with you on that. We'll take some time, about 15 to 20 minutes for you to work on that and be ready to share some of the things that you're noticing, and we'll talk through some of these examples here together.
Yeah.
The approach was driven by speaking out, and then various by elders. We had additional posters, which they burned the fire and the law gesture, and then also use hashtags, tree wood and hashtag wood.
So that participation from Indigenous trust prior to the work of organization, generating financial resources, respect culture,
No.
Just checking in here. There are groups that would like some more time? Yeah, all right.
It's not like that.
Oh,
Like
right.
the web, or like the,
Okay.
and like, Google necessarily, from the perspective that. I'm sure,
Any groups need some more time at this point? Okay, cool. So let's talk a little bit about some of the movements and strategies. Let's start here. It looks like we had a group of 3 on the side. What did you end up selecting? What was the situation that you explored? Uh-huh.
And the problem with that indigenous people were not consulted about industrialization of tidal land.
Mhm.
And the forms of communication were meetings, events, and another one was community engagement strategies by working through language and education barriers. And the goal of
Yeah.
common patterns was like a goal of solidarity across the globe. It was to inform communities in order to spark like change because people can't really do anything about a situation if they're not aware of it fully.
And what did you notice about kind of connecting to these ideas.
Dominant powers would go back to because a lot of the people only have a certain time, like to voice their concerns and protests. So in a sense, their voices would need to be under a form of control by the dominant powers.
Great. And how about this group of three back here?
Community, which is mining,
Mhm.
and so ways of the community, which is public demonstration, voices of resistance, daily meetings of indigenous art.
Mhm.
And some of the patterns that we saw during the activism was that a lot of these were money driven, some of the vendors, like the influencing money driven, and versus the indigenous community is more culturally driven, and that's what they're all doing. And then for the epistemic injustice, we really discussed like whitewash history,
Mhm.
showing how we have been disadvantaged in the fact that we grew up and things like learning about history that has been very whitewashed and not like concrete and like to the point, I feel like we've gone around certain injustices. And so we talked about how kind of our community wants to go to college or start expanding our education to start educating ourselves on the lack of history that we're given.
Mhm.
And then was some alternate studies doing. It wasn't really with our activities and strategies, but we thought about boarding school examples
Mhm.
and our indigenous community. I think that when the boarding schools were happening, there was kind of a common way of like trying to take away education from indigenous people and like educate them in a way that they wanted them to be educated, like they wanted them to be educated in a white system.
Mhm.
And so they were their education was basically taken.
So, adding to this conversation, whose education are we learning and kind of being socialized into, I think is an important component here as well. Do we have a group of 4 or 2 pairs? Okay, how about let's start with Kate Angelou.
So we also discussed the forest rights.
Mhm.
And within this movement in 1997, Orissa Authority signed a contract with Sterlite India, which led to them illegally taking the indigenous land, which violated Schedule 5 of the Indian Constitution that protects tribal land. And like the indigenous people in these communities were not consulted before like this took place.
Mhm.
And during this time to like communicate about this issue, they could write complaints, but it needed to be registered by June 22nd, 2002. And then the public meetings were held on June 26th, 2002, which gave like a small window for people to get their voices heard. And then they also communicated through protests, which started in 2007. But then in the book, it also mentioned that language and location barriers erase the participatory opportunities for the indigenous communities.
Mhm.
And then for the second question, in this chapter, discussed how they had like difficult times communicating and like didn't really have a voice. And at the end, it mentioned that their voices seek to decolonize the structures of knowledge production by making visible the racism underlying the constitution of colonial knowledge. And then for the third question, It kind of connected with subaltern studies theory, because it like involves a marginalized population, and they were not like given the resources they needed to like speak out about these issues.
Right. And I like the way that you both were pointing to this tactic of almost creating a veil or front that there's an opportunity to communicate in voice, but creating so many restrictions and barriers, such a limited time to actually speak out and address that in a way that didn't really allow those voices to be included and participate. Oh, you can share your concerns, but by the time you're able to, like, the window to participate is closed. So a lot of those strategies that in many ways are controlling and constraining what participation can occur. And how about that partnership over here?
So we did the seawater and land protection in the United States, protectors in the United States,
Mhm.
which was the Native Americans in Standing Rock, North Dakota, against the building of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And this is basically just a protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline, having pipeline revenue system. And they argued that it threatened the indigenous livelihood by impacting the immediate fishing and spawning grounds. And they used different various forms of communication. Some of them were signs on the beach that said "no coal." They also spoke out in protest, as well as having elders give various speeches. They did another symbolic gesture with a poster check, like picture poster check, and then they burned it after they put a stamp on it that said non-negotiable. They used social media within hashtags that were like hashtag win the treaty or even hashtag no TAPL, which stood for Dakota Access Pipeline. In addition, the organization worked in protesting actions, generalizing financial resources, reciting poetry, creating art, and singing songs. And then within the second question, we discussed that they all kind of went around the form of taking land. In addition, most of them portray the struggles for indigenous sovereignty rooted in the struggle to find their voice or to speak out for themselves. And as well as in the third question, that's kind of how we related it to the other studies theory, because they had a hard time like finding their voice and making a movement to speak up for themselves, as well as going back to what another group said was the discussion of the whitewashing theory of history on how it was taught from one perspective.
Yeah, this is excellent. Thank you, Christina. I think that the combination of the lack of sort of sovereignty with the challenges that creates and the ability to develop kind of a fully realized voice and experience really goes hand in hand, right? And again, if we connect it back to that Lake reading a few weeks ago, the ability for creating this sort of shared identity and set of experiences is such a crucial element when that has been historically taken away and not really permitted in the same fashion. So I appreciate the group's sharing. I think that these, there's so many examples that are given in this chapter that unpacking and looking at these really helps us to understand the unique forms of activism that are happening, right? Whether it's using social media, such as hashtag, using signs, using kind of meetings and community organizing, the kind of engagement that's happening in both a local situated perspective, public perspective, mediated perspective are all really important elements of these strategies. Creating a sense of culture, of solidarity, of voice, and sort of inserting voice and perspective where that's oftentimes been missed. And the challenge with being able to speak about these issues and engage with them within these kind of dominant frameworks with which people find themselves, I think are really speaking to the unique challenges and scenario that a lot of activists find themselves in and needing to push back. So I appreciate the work of groups in kind of talking through these different issues. So let's take a short break, come back at about 2:15, 2:16. We'll pick up on the other readings, spend a bit of time on that, and then wrap up for the day. got everybody back. So earlier today, I got my Spotify Wrapped. My mornings, ominous post-apocalyptic eerie. My afternoon, mystical bogan psychedelica. My nights, poetic hype indie heads. Tell me that you are a 30-year-old self-deprecating millennial from the Pacific Northwest without telling me that you're. So. Oh, Spoon. Who else on here? I've got Spoon, Gorillas from the Jewels, Kendrick Lamar, Murder by Death, and a couple others. It's always fun to feel judged by Spotify. I saw a meme going around about how the rap is kind of like your report card. But yeah, so we just have a couple quick things to talk about before we finish up. So I'll try to get through this pretty quickly here. This last chapter I want to get at is associated with the Flint water crisis. You're probably familiar with that from a few years ago, but I want to share a clip in a minute that provides some additional context here about the situation, and specifically some of the things that I think this chapter is helping to bring to the table. One idea that we've talked about is that there's this kind of unifying force or identity or experience that allows movements to come together, right? And motherhood is being studied and analyzed here as a unique topic and a very uniting force in communication for social change, especially as it relates to issues of environmental advocacy and racial justice, right? That while there were an array of activists and individuals who might not be mothers, right, that the specific advocacy that women and that mothers had was a really unique component of addressing the water crisis and creating this sort of new space for activism and participation. So to kind of give you some information about this, you might be familiar. This happened several years ago, but it's still been an ongoing issue in which in Flint, Michigan, it was found that the water, this was around 2015, that the water used for tap water, drinking water, was no longer safe. We're finding lead. It was, there are videos going around of the water turning brown. And that was gaining national attention and response. One thing that I think is important to recognize here is that Flint, Michigan is significantly comprised of people of color who make up the majority of the population in Michigan, many people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. This came about because Michigan had switched the water system to Flint River. And a variety of cost-cutting measures in the state meant that there was a lack of access to safe water that disproportionately impacted the community. In addition to lead, they found that an unhealthy amount of disinfecting products were being found in that water supply too. So while there was investigation, the investigation into the water crisis did not officially begin until the next year in 2016. There are still concerns that the water supply and quality there is still not up to standards. There's a What Are You Fighting For, which was named and developed based on the water crisis in particular, right? Has this count up timer that's saying that this has continued to not have this clean water. It's called Flintgate, use that language. This is Rich Snyder, who was the governor at the time, who is kind of caricatured here to talk about the ways that they felt that the state was not being responsive to the issue. So it's kind of messy, right? But this site is in many ways trying to gather and aggregate a lot of information about the water crisis, about individuals impacted by that, and so on. So looks more like a site created in the 2000s than the 2010s, but I do think highlights some important issues and advocacy here. I also wanted to share a video that I think captures a lot of the key ideas and things that happened here. I feel like we're being algorithmically targeted for like solar energy because of this.
Are shocking enough.
Would you believe that? People have dumped in this river forever. It's like we're in a cesspool. My tub, you should see it, is brown.
And then come the headlines. An American city failed to provide basic protections to its citizens, and now the children of Flint have much higher than normal levels of lead in their blood. Rick Snyder, governor of Michigan, has apologized.
I'm sorry, and I will fix it.
President Obama declared a national emergency.
You can't shortchange basic services that we provide to our people.
And now 2016 presidential candidates are starting to weigh in.
The governor of that state acted as though he didn't really care.
Lead poisoning is terrible and terrifying. No amount of exposure is safe. And there's evidence that years after we got it out of paint, gas, and more, it contributed to a drastic drop in crime in the 90s. The city has switched back to cleaner water, but the effects will last decades. We take clean water for granted. How could this possibly happen in 2016? Well, you've got to rewind to 2011. Flint was broke. It had lost about half its population after the car factories closed. It had 1.1 billion in unfunded pension costs. It had to cut half its police force. Michigan had a solution called emergency managers.
Now he's been appointed by the governor. A turnaround Flint's finances might be welcome.
These managers can make cost-cutting measures without the normal political procedure.
I think what we have to do is look at the expense side first. There could be services that we can no longer provide the city.
And they decided the city could save money on water. Flint would stop buying water from Detroit and join a new regional water system. And as a temporary measure, Flint would use water from the Flint River. The switch happened in 2014. Who decided to do this exactly is under intense debate. But regardless of blame, the story gets worse. Residents saw and tasted the dirty water and started complaining.
Water's brown, has a bad odor. I'm afraid to even feed it to my cat or my dog. We should not have to pay for the water. It's nasty.
But the city claimed federal tests showed the water was safe. An employee at the Environmental Protection Agency linked a Michigan report to a local activist, which showed the water had higher than normal lead levels. The city's response? Flint told the woman the lead came from her plumbing. It took an outside investigation by Virginia Tech researchers that found elevated lead levels in the water for the state to admit there was a problem in September 2015.
So corrosion's eating up the pipe, it's eating up the iron pipe, it's causing main breaks, it's causing discarded water, and about 20% of the homes there's just too much lead.
In October 2015, the government bought water filters for its citizens and switched back to water from Detroit. Before all this, 2.1% of the city's children had high blood levels. After it was 4%. For kids under 5, the most affected zip code, it was 6.3%. Why did Flint poison its citizens? Under emergency managers from the state, it wanted to save money. To start to reverse the effects will cost dearly. Just switching back to Detroit's water cost $12 million. A class action lawsuit against the city is pending.
So again, you probably followed this when it was in the news a little bit, but I think this adds some additional context here to this issue and its impact, right? And one of the impacts of this was, as mentioned in the lead levels, that it disproportionately impacted children. So in conjunction with this, this kind of brought about some of the unique focus on motherhood and the experiences of women and highlighting some of the challenges with regard to environmental justice, right? Environmental justice in particular is a framework that argues that people of color and low-income people in particular are disproportionately impacted by environmental pollution, environmental impacts. In fact, we see this through things like nuclear waste dumping in places like Yucca Mountain in Nevada. We also see this through the idea of climate refugees. For instance, In a lot of locations, the coastlines such as Florida, right, the impact both of natural disasters and also with rising sea levels has impacted those communities in particular. So environmental justice is about recognizing that the issues related to the environment do not impact people equally, right? That there are disproportionate ways that people find themselves affected. And due to inequities, including areas such as gender roles, gender segregated labor, and so on, women find themselves uniquely likely to experience these impacts. What this chapter and studies also bring us an understanding of is the ways in which women disproportionately might occupy roles as advocates and leaders on a lot of environmental topics. So what this chapter brings to the table is this idea of thinking about motherhood as rhetoric and thinking about it as a kind of unique uniting force. And I think this chapter does push back against some of the criticism of this framework, right? The concern that it might be essentializing, that, not all parents or people who give birth to children are necessarily women, but to identify this idea of motherhood, of occupying a parental role is really bringing about some unique experiences here. There's some really kind of visceral examples in this chapter talking about there's a woman who is in Flint and is noticing that her child has a rash and that this rash is coming from the disinfectant products and the material in the contaminated water supply. Right? So this chapter is arguing that motherhood offers agency within environmental justice that affords women authority to craft public judgments on those who threaten family and community and enable noble similar reflections and critiques in others, right? So identifying the ways in which children are impacted and disproportionately hurt, in using that unique role as a way of helping to fashion and make this kind of argument. The usage of public appeals, articulations, and performances of speakers is being used here as a strategy of advocacy too, and of placing them in these kind of leadership roles to communicate about issues. And also sort of suggesting that the rhetoric of reproduction, of reproducing, is being used here to kind of reproduce or reimagine what it means to communicate and engage about these and other topics. Again, I think that there's critique and pushback against this, right? The assumption of essentializing that, not all women are able to have children, and that, more broadly thinking about the role of a parent, I think is important. But by focusing specifically on the experiences of mothers impacted by the Flint water crisis, I think we're able to see the unique rhetorical role that this article is bringing to the table. So I had a group activity, but since we're getting kind of close on time, I'm going to go ahead and skip this one. But we do have in this week's Canvas prompt the chance for you to explore and get into some of the details related to this article in a little bit more specific. So you might use some time as you're working through this to notice some of the ways in which the current conditions of Flint are reflecting this kind of history and legacy, and the ways that motherhood as a rhetorical strategy has been present in a lot of other contexts as well. We look at environmental advocacy in other areas. If we think about the experiences, for instance, of missing and murdered Indigenous women, people talking about, their daughters being impacted by this issue are examples here of how this broader strategy is being employed. So I hope you find working through that chapter to be interesting and additive to the ideas that we've been talking about. So to wrap things up for this class, we have just our final 2 meetings next week. We'll have the Korean movement presentations on Monday, and we'll go down the line. Again, send me those before the start of Monday's class if you have visual aids or other material you'd like me to pull out. And then on Wednesday, we'll be doing our ORA presentation. I'll let you know. I should be getting the room number by the end of this week. We also talked about both Indigenous activism and environmental advocacy, again, helping us to shape and imagine what the future of social change communication looks like. Again, we're constantly doing and reevaluating what this is and what issues are emerging and how we're studying those issues. See a lot of changes in how new technology and social media is enabling advocacy related to those things. So I'm sure we'll continue to see this evolve and change even more over the course of our lives. So we'll have our presentations on Monday. Go ahead and either email or pass forward your partner activity if you haven't done so already. Make sure your group members' names are on it. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Enjoy the remaining daylight that we have. And I look forward to seeing you again for next Monday.